Recording in progress.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Cynthia Nichols. I'm the Regional Public Engagement Specialist with American Spaces here in the Embassy in Ukraine. I'm very excited to have everyone with us today. This is our third in a series of panels that were entitled Views from Ukraine. Today our discussion is on disinformation. Our moderator today is Press Attaché Dan Langenkamp. I just want to give you a little bit of information before we begin, and I will toss it to Dan in just a moment. Please put any questions that you have in the chat. I will monitor them, and then we can present them to the panel. Please make sure you mute and also turn off your cameras. The stream is recorded. This is recorded and is being streamed to several embassies. It is on the record. And when we go into breakout sessions, those breakout sessions are also on the record, but they will not be recorded. Thank you very much for being here. And now I'm going to toss it off to Dan. Thanks so much.
Okay, disinformation, misinformation, fake news, propaganda, whatever you call it, it points to the same thing, which is the use of information for strategic means. Today we're going to be talking about how Russia is using disinformation in Ukraine, specifically amid its buildup on Ukraine's borders, how Russia is using misinformation and disinformation to achieve its aims. So how is Russia using disinformation? What are its methods and tactics? What narratives is it pushing? What could it play if Russia stages an incursion or a further incursion into Ukraine? And what are the what other goals could Russia have in this effort? So today we have three of the most important voices in Ukraine on disinformation, and we're going to hear their views. We have Yevhen from Stop Fake. We have Arisia from Chatham House, and we have Volodymyr, the analytics director at Inner News. You have their bios in your programs, so I won't waste any time with that. Let's just get started. Over the last few weeks, there's been a huge discussion about the role of disinformation. People following have seen officials across the Western world talk about the role that it has played. I would like to ask if our panelists could talk about the methods and the goals that Russia has in this effort. I'd like to put it to Yevhen first. Yevhen, could you tell us a little bit about this?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me on the panel. It's a great pleasure for me to share my views because Stop Fake was following Russian disinformation since 2014. We've been monitoring it, debunking fake news, and mapping the main players and narratives. And of course, we notice the huge increase of the volume of disinformation recently, as you might guess. And also we see what's the main emphasis of disinformation these days. For example, currently Russian disinformation is doing a lot to dehumanize Ukrainians, like preparing for real war, not just disinformation as a part of paramilitary disinformation warfare. Also, we see further attempts to delegitimize Ukraine as a sovereign state, to undermine its sovereignty, to dehumanize Ukrainians, as I said. And also important feature is that Russian disinformation was creating very, very parallel reality for Russian audiences, for Ukrainian audiences, but also for Russian elites and Russian policymakers. And now we see how this disinformation basically became a part of their modus operandi. They pretty much believe in what they created. And this is one of the most dangerous part in them because they're living in a very parallel reality they've been creating since 2014.
Volodymyr, you can tell us what are the methods that Russia is using in this battle, in this fight?
Thank you, Dan. So first, of course, it's like the typical disinformation, typical fake news that Stop Fake is monitoring very well, for example, or some other fact checkers. But I would like to say that disinformation in Russian case shows that it is much deeper than that. Specialists, Ukrainian and other experts are using, for example, the word malinformation to identify an idea that this propaganda can use some facts, some true stories, some parts of the reality, but they then exaggerate the meaning of it. So they really often use part for the whole with this pars pro toto approach. And for example, if they pick up a problem that any country has, that Ukraine has, that United States have, that Europe has, etc., they just make it much bigger than it seems. So I think this is one of the key methods if we talk about the narratives, for example.
If you don't mind me interrupting, so we had this story recently about a boy. I guess it was in March when the earlier buildup of Russia's forces took place, and Russia had alleged that this young man or this boy had been killed by a Ukrainian drone or something like that. Could you talk perhaps about that example? Is this sort of an example about the way that they do this?
Yes, because there was no proof that this boy was killed by a Ukrainian drone. And for example, this is one of the key things. We can talk later about the network of Telegram channels, for example. They give you some messages, but these messages are A, unverified, and B, sometimes even unverifiable. So there is a source of messages, words, images that you cannot really verify. You cannot really say or falsify. You cannot really say whether it can be true or not true. And I think this is one of the most important approaches.
In that case, there was a drone that hit a boy, and Russia claimed it was, or no, a drone didn't hit a boy, but Russia claimed a drone did. And after that, it became verified that it was just a complete piece of misinformation. Is that right, Yevhen? Am I following that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. This is one of the examples of kind of shameful exploitation of children, of dead children for the purposes of disinformation. And previously, back in 2014, we had an absolutely fabulous story about a crucified boy, which was debunked 1,000 times after that, but is still used very often. And I was lecturing widely around the world, and I still was finding people who do believe in this story many years after it was debunked. And this is example how you can start pushing and promoting disinformation, and then it starts living its own life. And this is a dangerous element. And also we've seen how these disinformation narratives can sneak into the reporting work of journalists. For example, last week, Italian public television Rai Uno made a TV story about people in Donbass repeating all the main messages of Russian disinformation. And again, all those messages were debunked so many times that if they bother just to fact check the story, definitely they would not kind of fall under the spell of disinformation. But unfortunately, it did not happen.
Let me ask Arisia. So you follow some of these narratives quite closely that Russia is pushing. Give us the top three.
Well, I would say it's important to understand, and it's great that we are discussing it today, of course, when the headlines of all international media are about possible invasion. And what I would like to say first, that disinformation, it's part of the full spectrum warfare. This disinformation is here to basically exploit the brains of the populations, to shatter the resilience and desire for resistance in the country, but also control the political decision-making in the targeted country. So the key narratives of Russia about Ukraine has been that it's a failed state, that Ukraine's leadership is not an independent leadership, that it's owned by Western, especially Washington puppeteers, that Soros is involved. So spinning this conspiracy theory in about Ukraine, in a way denying Ukraine any agency by saying that Russia says, this is not a nation that is able to govern itself. And of course, more recently, we see a more dangerous disinformation about United States deploying chemical weapons in the Donbass. And this is when we are talking about false flag operation. A lot of people are thinking about Little Green Man, the type of Crimea annexation, but information is also part of the false flag operation that Russia deploys. In a way, if you want to create this shattered mirror effect where nothing is clear, where you have society divided, turned against the elite, and this is how you undermine the enemy from within, and also undermine Western coalition in support of Ukraine.
I'm glad you raised that question about the chemical weapons. So what's going on there? Why would they talk about this? Is this just to spread disinformation to discredit the United States, or what's the goal?
Well, I think there's something that what Volodymyr mentioned about malinformation, where they are blending fact and fiction. There has been reports from parts of the occupied Ukraine that the Russians has actually moved to one of the largest chemical plants, Tyrol, some chemical substances that could be used to cause the environmental disaster that would later be blamed either on the United States or NATO forces. So they may be plotting ground or preparing a ground for a possible escalation that would give a pretext for Russian peacekeepers to come. This is another thing for us to remember, that in Russia, for Russian domestic public, Russian military adventurism abroad is presented as peacekeepers. They are securing the periphery of the Russian Federation by establishing peace and clamping on color revolution and protests.
I wonder actually, so that raises some of the historical precedents here that have existed in the past. Has Russia done this in the past? What other countries have done this? I mean, this does, I must say, remind me of things that we've heard about before. You know, and back in, say, World War II, or even in, you know, in the Cold War, it was called propaganda. Can we talk a little bit about that? Volodymyr, do you have any perspective on this?
Well, of course, we can compare to the World War II, to the way how Soviet Union, for example, attacked Finland, or to the way how the Germans attacked Poland by instigating, the provocation. And this is what we are discussing always here with an idea of a false flag operation. This is what can happen, and what Orisa has rightly pointed out. And I would like to also follow up on this issue of chemical weapons and biological weapons. This is also a very old narrative of Russia. We see the narrative of biological laboratories that were established by United States, and for example, across Ukraine to make some exercises on humans. And let me tell you that this narrative, if you put it into the minds of frightened people and frightened population, which tends to see, threats everywhere, and this is what Ukrainian society is now about, it's kind of a very fruitful ground to launch these operations.
So we're talking about creating, sort of using it not only as sometimes, or possibly as a pretext for an invasion, but also to sort of divide and undermine Ukrainian society. Is that right?
Exactly. This is one of the, of course, this is one of the techniques. I would say that the key goal of propaganda, of information warfare, is not even to lie, it's not even to deceive, but as my colleagues have pointed it out already, is to show that the opponent either doesn't exist, so the negation of the agency, as Orisa said. So therefore, they're saying Ukraine doesn't exist, it didn't exist historically, it was all Russia, etc., or doesn't have a right to exist, doesn't have a moral right to exist. And therefore, we have the other key narrative that Ukrainians are basically about far right, about fascists, and we can see this narrative even in the 19th century when the way how Russian culture, for example, were presenting Ukrainian Cossack past. So this is nothing new about it.
So how does this relate to some of the things that Mr. Putin has said, in recent times, and how does it relate to some of the philosophical underpinnings of the Russian Federation right now? I mean, we have heard about, Vladimir Putin's desire to have an empire, to create a sphere of influence. How is this disinformation discussion related to all of that?
Well, if you follow Russian intellectual debates, you will see that some of the ideologies that are present in Russia, they really have roots in early 20th century philosophical doctrines in Europe and elsewhere in the world. For example, the idea of social Darwinism, that the politics is a great fight for influences and the great fight of big geopolitical animals. And recently we had read, you've probably seen it, the article of a former advisor to Putin, Mr. Surkov, who is also a philosopher and writer and who is behind all this war in Donbass, who said that Russia should naturally be expanding. And I think this comes to an idea of this Russian empire, which we see, for example, in Neo-Eurasians and some other doctrines, that Russia will survive only when it is expanding. Either it is expanding its borders or it is shrinking. It will not survive in a clear-cut borders of a nation state. And if we analyze the concept of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the idea that Russia goes beyond its political borders, I think this is an important thing to understand.
So what about else in Ukrainian history? Part of this is the disinformation is related to saying that Ukrainians aren't a real people, that Russian and Ukrainian people are one, really. There's no difference between them ethnically or historically. Is that true? Yeah, go ahead, and anybody jump in. I'm sorry, just go ahead.
Look, there is a clear, if you look back at any history, you will see the problems of names, for example. My favorite example is that if you look at the map of 10th century Europe, you will see the current Germany will called Eastern Frankia. That doesn't mean that we are calling Germany, Eastern France right now, right? So this is the same trick used by Russians about the concept of Ukraine, Rus, etc. But historians, ethnographers are clearly saying that these are different people, these are different nations, these are different languages. That's obvious thing. These are different customs and traditions, and the way how Russians were trying to erase this difference. They were trying to do with many different things, from Holodomor to what linguists are called linguicide, the politics of extermination of Ukrainian language.
Did someone else want to jump in, Yevhen or Arissa?
I just want to quote Timothy Snyder, who's, I think, pointed very sharply. He said, after reading Putin's essay on history, I feel like a zoologist in a slaughterhouse. From the historical perspective, there's little you can put together, or even, in terms of debunking. But I think here is the trick. Putin is weaponizing history as much as weaponizing information, and that's part of creating a narrative where for Putin, the project of Russia is the past. And for Ukraine, the project of development is the future. Putin wants to deny Ukraine the future by just saying that it's a common past with Russia. And this is why we have a war and this aggression where Ukraine is trying to reclaim its right for having its own future.
So in terms of his worldview, I mean, Ukraine's then sort of positioned towards the West and towards NATO and towards the European Union is threatening to this whole worldview. And, that's sort of part of this battle, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
I can just jump in and say that speaking about that from geopolitical point of view, for Putin, it's definitely a zero-sum game. So if he see Ukraine leaving, he doesn't see much for Russia to develop. And I agree totally with Arissa that for him, it's a project about the past. And also, if we would look at the disinformation they've been pushing, it involved a lot of those things both panelists already mentioned, like Ukrainian language, which from his point of view does not exist, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, and of course, religion is also very widely used to produce all types of fakes and disinformation. So if they see that this can be used as a problem, as a pretext, they really want to find all those cracks in the cultural milieu and try to make it bigger. And that's exactly what disinformation is making. And also it translates very quickly into practical things. For example, if they produce some piece of disinformation that Russian language is suppressed in Ukraine, they can very easily organize it as a pretext for military intervention, because from Putin's point of view, Russia ends only where there is no Russians. So basically everywhere where the Russians are, it is Russia.
Let's talk a little bit about the actual structure and methods a little bit. We touched on it earlier. I think Volodymyr mentioned Telegram channels. Telegram is a really important mechanism that they're using in Ukraine. I don't know if all of our viewers understand how Telegram works or if it's as popular in Western Europe. I know it is popular, but let's talk about anonymous Telegram channels and the structure of the way Russia is doing this in Ukraine in particular. Is this an operation that is organized by the FSB? Are these loosely federated groups of people that are just, playing on the language that President Putin is using and other spokespeople? Can you give us some information about the structure, about the operation here as it attacks Ukraine?
Yeah, if I may, from my point of view, this disinformation ecosystem works really as a very systematic, very well organized, very well financed by Russian government. Definitely all those disinformation messages are coming in a very centralized way from state actor, and of course they use very different platforms, and they are very flexible with platforms, so it all depends on the availability. For example, back in 2014 in Ukraine there were available all Russian TV channels, more than 80 of them, and they were weaponizing them. Then when Ukrainian government, Ukrainian regulator actually decided to get rid of Russian TV channels, they immediately started to look for other options, and they started to work very actively with social media, with messengers, and Telegram you mentioned is one of them, because first of all it allows huge anonymity from the point of view of those who disseminate information, but also it has a kind of a loose control compared to other social media. And Telegram is historically Russian product, and we don't have evidences that Russian government does not control data and all other things connected to how Telegram is operating. So from the point of view of the ownership and financing, it's a very murky platform, and the least regulated out of those which are now available in Ukraine. And that's why it's always used for disinformation purposes, for example, to reach out to Ukrainian military. We have two popular Telegram channels which pretend to be Ukrainian channels for military and allegedly coming from general staff of the armed forces. But they never post anything in Ukrainian. They use only Russian language, and they promote Russian messages, Russian narratives. So for me, if it looks like a duck and if it walks like a duck, well, it is duck then, you know.
I wanted to give a tip. So for our audience, which is mostly journalists, you could log on to these, or you can subscribe to these Telegram channels. And Telegram actually has a translation mechanism where you can read the Russian. So Yevhen, what are the biggest channels, like the ones that we hear that the Ukrainian parliament's using, and that that are very popular with the political elite?
Yeah, actually here everybody is using them, and including Stop Fake, because we, on one hand, we criticizing them, but on the other hand, we want to be in the loop, you know, and know what is happening over there, and also have our voice to be seen. So it's one of the platforms which is used, and actually
the channels that you guys watch over at Stop Fake.
Yeah, actually, I can show you. I can share it later, kind of a list for the participants to look after. And yeah, I think
you have to make sure you put the warning: smoking is bad for your health.
Yeah,
we just would like to give you a warning. Well, what you're recommending.
President Zelensky admitted to reading some of these channels, like Legitimny and Resident. And he said, you know, it was like going into a hall of mirrors, and he said that or implied that he was going to stop reading those channels. But it's sort of I think that was an indication of how powerful they are. Some of these channels have hundreds of thousands of viewers, isn't that right?
Let me jump in. Yeah, hopefully I'm not a Telegram blogger, you know, but one thing about Telegram, which it changes completely the way how we approach information, because as Yevhen said, they are anonymous. But what is the second feature of most of these channels is that they are pretending they give you insights. They're pretending that there are some people, some hidden people in the office of the president or in the ministries, etc., that knows everything, and it gives the audience like the most hidden messages, the most hidden information you can even imagine. And therefore people want to have these insights. They want to have these rumors, you know, they want to have this feeling of participation, and therefore they are reading it. But of course the problem is that what I mentioned earlier, that it is unverifiable. So of course you can invent any story without any proof, and so this is an insight, and therefore people will read it. The second thing is that you mentioned there are hundreds of thousands of followers, but contrary to Twitter, to Facebook, to some other social networks, Telegram is very untransparent. We cannot really check if this audience is okay. For example, with Twitter, we can analyze the followers and say, using the algorithm, well, these are this particular account has probably 40% or 30% of inauthentic audience, inauthentic fans. But with Telegram, you can only see indirect proof, for example, the curves of a drastic increase of the audience. So some of the Ukrainian journalists just made experiments. They registered their Telegram channels, and they addressed the companies who are selling this audience, and it shows that you can easily do that.
Yeah, wasn't it? I'm not sure I remember exactly the organization. It may have been Liga, the news organization, had an investigation where they created a Telegram channel that was for people that believed in a flat earth, and they immediately were able to buy Telegram followers to make the channel quite popular, and they had about 25,000 followers or something like that. Do you remember that case?
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Ivan. Yeah, of course. There was investigation on Liga. There was investigations on I think Detector Media, and we at Internews Ukraine made investigation rather on Telegrams, but also on Twitter. But you ask a question: why president is reading it? Why people in office of the president were reading it? Because when they appeared, you cannot really judge. You cannot really say that they're promoting. They're clearly pro-Kremlin, etc. They're masking very well. They're masking for a kind of Ukrainian users, etc. And I think people in the office of the president, they were really thinking that there is somebody in the office of the president who is, leaking this information, or who is inventing the story and creating the discourse.
So let me change subjects a little bit. How does the disinformation in Ukraine differ from the disinformation that we've seen in the United States or in Europe? Are there qualitative differences in the way that this system functions? Mauricia?
Yeah, the biggest difference is that this Ukrainian disinformation would be reflecting the realities of Ukrainian politics, war, and other scenes. And that's a specific of disinformation. So they want to target audiences in different countries with those messages which are relevant to them, and build those parallel realities which might vary from Ukraine to other European countries to United States. But what is common for all those systems, that they are, as I said, very well coordinated. They are very dynamic in terms of how to look which platforms work better for each demographics. And also we see how some messages are promoted across platforms, are promoted across countries. So they might start on anonymous Telegram channel and then go to the second tier news websites, then to news agencies. Then they are translated into different languages by companies like RT. We see Sputnik is doing something about that. And by the end of the day, everybody is discussing that. And when we start looking at that retroactively to find the initial source of that story, sometimes it's impossible for one very simple reason, because they are quoting each other. So it's like a catch-22, and there is no end to this vicious circle.
Marissa, do you see differences between the way the system operates in Ukraine versus in, say, London, where you're sitting?
Well, I would like, again, to bring us to a bigger picture of why all of this is going on. And in a way, this is what we are living in through this battle between autocracies and democracies. Of course, Ukraine is the frontline state in that way, and its democracy is poorly consolidated, and it gives more kind of open door for Russia with the proximity of language. That's much easier, with a kind of quite toxic Ukrainian media space that is quite partisan, is using some of these Russian narratives to undermine the ruling party, let's say. So they would, in a way, amplify, do the jobs for the Russians, if you want. But I think there is a similarity, in a way, again, of using these domestic cleavages, playing on partisan politics, and also I think going more and more into social media, something that we've discussed. Citizens across the world are now getting more news from social media than from television or print press. This is a new revolution that is going on in the media consumption, and this gives Russia an upper hand in a way, because its agenda is destructive. Russia's agenda is not about building a new ecosystem of free flow of information. Russia's agenda is to basically humiliate the West, and especially United States in Eastern Europe, by showing that it's weak and feeble in defending its allies. And this is what is at stake right now. That's why US is such a target in Russian disinformation. And this is, I would be interested to see if there are some of these narratives about US plotting a war against Russia in Ukraine at present also in the US information space, in social media especially.
Right, so that undermines American support within America for any kind of action that has to take place, or it undermines the support for the U.S. government effort to try to create unity among allies and all of our foreign policy. Is
And
that
Dan,
what you're
we
saying?
have actually two questions. There's a follow-up question. To what extent does this work among Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and are they hoping for Russia to intervene? Do our panelists have an answer to that?
I think we have to make a clear distinction between Russian-speaking Ukrainians and pro-Russian Ukrainians. There is a huge difference, and maybe for somebody very long from Ukraine, it is not that evident. There are lots of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, I would say even majority, because Ukraine is still, in many aspects, many regions, especially East and South, are Russian-speaking regions, but they are patriots of Ukraine, and they are, to say the least, very skeptical about Russia. We can see on public opinion polls, for example, the huge drop of popularity of Mr. Putin in 2014. And I think about 80% of Ukrainians, or even more, consider Mr. Putin as a very, very bad personality. I think even bigger. So we can see also, we can look at the fall of popularity of the pro-Russian parties. We have at least two, and we see over the past year, they're really losing in popularity. Of course, there are still citizens who would identify Ukraine with Russia, but if we look at these polls, at the party popularity, we are talking probably about maximum 10 or maybe 12%.
It's been interesting to see the decline in support for, the favorability rating of President Putin and the favorability rating of Russia over the last 30 years has really just declined the whole time. Let me ask this question, and then we'll go to another audience question. Are Ukrainians getting better at detecting disinformation and being less vulnerable to it? That's been they've been under assault from it for a long time.
Yeah, of course, Ukrainians made a huge progress since 2014, and every year organizations like Internews are even doing the measurements, polls looking into the level of the media literacy, if they recognize disinformation. But the disinformation also knows that Ukrainian skills are much better, so they also improve, I will not say quality, but they improve penetrability into Ukrainian society. For example, as Volodymyr said, the popularity of Russia and everything Russian declined dramatically. So now some disinformation outlets want to masquerade themselves as something very Ukrainian, using Ukrainian language. You can see Ukrainian flags and say, oh, this is a patriotic something, because everything which is labeled Russian is very toxic these days. And also, if we would look at the media consumption in Ukraine, so the structure completely changed, and now less than 10% are consuming Russian media at the regular basis, and even less are trusting what they see. It's a very good sign. And of course, Russia is trying to kind of make quick changes and adjust to that. But on another hand, of course, it all depends on many other things. For example, if Ukrainian media provide enough information, what's the quality of that information, how government is involved in that. And there are, of course, many, many ways how to improve that. And so, yeah, improvement is there, but definitely there is some part of the people who still are not very kind of literate. And that's to whom we want to cater more and more, and to explain them the intricacies of disinformation.
I understand that's sort of in the south and in the east of the country with more rural and less educated audiences. Is that correct?
Not always, not always. Actually, we have that problem across the geography of Ukraine, especially situation with COVID-19 demonstrated very low, so to say, scientific literacy of Ukrainians, and that happened across the whole regions. And also it was used by disinformation as well.
Okay, let me add a little bit then. Can I add something? I think there are two challenges, unexpected challenges, related to the very nature of democracy worldwide, not only in Ukraine. The first is critical thinking. The second is plurality. So the traditional propaganda, for example, Soviet propaganda was was very efficient when people were lacking critical thinking. Today, propaganda is much more tricky thing. This is something Peter Pomerantsev very well would write about it. And we see, for example, through different monitorings of the minds of Ukrainians that people sometimes are subject to disinformation precisely because they're critically thinking. For example, what these Telegram channels are telling you, that you should be thinking much more critically than you used to think when you, for example, consume ordinary media. And therefore, we will provide you all these insights, etc. The second thing is plurality, of course, because Ukrainians reply that, well, many Ukrainians say that, well, I read different sources and then I combine them and then I take my own opinion. The question is, what if among these different sources is a disinformation source?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Let's take another audience question now.
Sure. Going back to the idea that language is very powerful, one of our journalists said, last year, Union Agency decided not to publish news in English anymore. Does anyone have an understanding for the rationale of that?
Union.
My apologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Union is a part of Kolomoisky holding. I don't know what are the reasons for that, but I can assure you that there are other very well English language sources. For example, recently we have NV, Новое Время, which is one of the most respectful Ukrainian media launching its website in English. We have Kyiv Post, we have Kyiv Independent. The website which I run, which I'm a direct editor, is Ukraine World. You can also follow us. You have Ukraine Crisis Media Center, you have Stop Fake, you have many other good sources.
And Ukrinform, also the state agency, also has English language. There's a lot. And also you can use Google Translate to get information in news now. Okay, so we need to wrap up. We have about 2 minutes, and now we have a lot of important questions to ask. One question that I'd like to put this to the group is, what's the relationship between the journalists that we have online and this fight? What role do they play? How can you help them? Let's speak practically. Let's go to Arissa, perhaps.
Well, I think, first of all, it's great, this initiative of views from Ukraine with voices who understand Ukraine. I think part of the reasons why Russia has this upper hand and leverage by shaping discourse about Ukraine, or I would say influencing discussion, is because Ukraine is not very well known to the international audiences, not well understood, this kind of, as some historians called it, unexpected nation. So by being misunderstood and not understood provides an open space for an aggressor to speak on your behalf. But now we are indeed in a very critical times when informing Western audiences, informing policymakers what is at stake, what it is exactly Ukraine is fighting for, actually traveling outside of Kyiv, because, right, it's important to get the temperature in the capital, but over this 8 years after Euromaidan, there's a real consensus in the center-west of Ukraine, and it's changing towards joining that consensus in the southeast, that Ukraine wants to be ruled by law and not ruled by force. And this struggle that we are facing right now is in establishing this democracy based on rule of law that Russia wants to deny. So I think we also run a Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, where we're doing a bit deeper dives into showing this transformation of Ukraine. And I assure you that there was a revolution in Ukraine in the mindset of where it belongs, but in the West, there has to be still discussion where Ukraine belongs. We have this ambiguity and kind of certain dissonance among the European member states, such as France and Germany, Italy, where Ukraine belongs. And I'm sure media can contribute a lot to explaining why Ukraine belongs to Europe and why this is an advantage for this whole indivisible European security that Putin is actually talking about.
Yeah, one of the things that we like to say is that you walk through the streets of Ukraine and of Kyiv, and you see what a European city it is. And it's very clear when you talk to the Ukrainian people where they see their futures. So that's something that we'd like to emphasize with our audiences today, I think. Yevhen, what else? I'm always surprised that there aren't more formal relationships between media and debunking organizations like yours or civil society that can help give journalists the information they need to report accurately. Is there anything that can be done like that? I mean,
yeah, so one of the problem is that actually we still lack in good fact-checking in media very often. This is problem number one. And the second problem is that media should always remember that one of the main purposes of disinformation is to undermine existing institutions, democratic institutions. And us media is one of them. So they don't want to see us around, and that would make them much happier and to make much more space for them. And if you remember when the time when Speaker of Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that starting tomorrow, MFA starts its fact-checking operation. So what they did, they just rubber stamp any articles they disagree with a stamp fake. And for me, that was a crucial moment when I realized that we continue to do this work, even if it might be very straight genre in which we work. So we're correcting someone else's lies, So I never thought that I would become famous because of that, But if there is a need in the society in what fact checkers are doing, we really need to continue doing that, because otherwise disinformation would take all the space. And there are two more things I would like to say very quickly, what else we can do to remove disinformation from media. So we really need to talk about deplatforming disinformation from main social media platforms. And we now work on that with Google, for example, but evidently it's a long shot, it would take some time. Another important thing is sanctioning those people who are personally involved in production of lies and production of disinformation, for one very simple reason, because in Ukrainian case, disinformation kills people literally, and they are calling to kill Ukrainians and burn Ukrainians on Kiev's main street, So we approach the level of absolutely Rwandan genocidal talk, of radio, the Milkolin, So we are already on the brink of that. So we really need to be very aggressive, even I would say. And today I saw the draft of the sanctions which were proposed in DC, and sanctions against propagandists is a part of that. And this is a great step, and we need to do that. And last but not least, to withdraw advertising from those companies which disseminate fakes and disinformation, not to participate in financing it. So that's what we can do from the media culture point of view.
Thank you, Yevhen. And so let's see. Let me ask a final question of Volodymyr. Volodymyr, if and when there is an incursion in Ukraine, what is it going to look like? What should reporters that are online and the other people look for in terms of disinformation? How is that going to appear when we talk about this?
Well, we already talked about these false flag operations that they can take place. We also see that how many, for example, Russian reports are portraying a Ukrainian army which is on its own soil as a dehumanizing, as Yevhen said, as committing crimes, etc., which is obviously far from truth. But I think we can. It is difficult to predict what will happen, for example. But it is quite possible that Russia will try to take some other parts of Ukrainian territory and say it is defending. So this discourse that it is defending, I think this is the most dangerous thing, which many people in the world are really consumed about, that Russia is defending its borders, etc. This is clearly said by the Russian experts and Russian intellectuals themselves. They want to re-establish the so-called security belt they have during the Cold War. And security belt means that they should be surrounded by a kind of a vassal states. That's what they're striving for, and therefore they're talking about Yalta, therefore they're criticizing Helsinki agreements, etc. And I think this is the most important thing. So we should also look at these fears of NATO enlargement as a kind of a bluff, which doesn't let us to see the true goals of Russian expansion.
And with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you, Volodymyr, for those thoughts, putting this in the big picture. I want to thank Yevhen and Orissa also for these insights today. This was, I thought, a great discussion. Really, when we talk about disinformation, I think it's fair to say, and this is what, at the U.S. Embassy we tell all of our visitors, there's two wars in Ukraine. There is a war, an active, hot war going on in the Donbass, and an occupation in Crimea, but there is a war that runs through every cell phone and every computer in the country. It's a disinformation war where Russia is seeking to undermine the Ukrainian state and divide Ukraine from its Western partners. I want to thank you all. We're going to go to breakout rooms now so that everybody can go even more deeply into this discussion with our panelists. Thank you very much. I'm Dan Langenkamp. I'm the press attaché at U.S. Embassy Kyiv, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you to our panelists again.
Thank you very much.
What are we supposed to say while we are?